Hello, you wonderful people, and welcome to another episode of Centric. This being a show where I talk about crime dramas that I watch. For today's episode, I'm going to talk about the latest episode of Walker. A lot of interesting things went down in this episode, so let's break it down. Going to let you know a little behind the scenes. I actually recorded this review all the way through, but sadly, bullshit circumstances happened and the recording no longer exists. So, first and foremost, let's start off with the Adriana situation. Obviously, picking up where last episode left off. In certain regards, we find out that Adriana got arrested. But obviously, for Mickey, it doesn't make any sense, the circumstances about what, led to her mom's arrest, because apparently it was like a drinking and hit and run type of situation. But for Mickey, it's like, that's not my mom. And also, with Walker's help, Walker offering to kind of look into it for her, they end up getting a case file. But obviously, Mickey's immediately thinking like, oh, like someone is, abusing their power or something or like something's going wrong here. There's no way my mom's responsible. But Adriana admits to Mickey, like, no, I'm the one that did it. But regardless of that, Mickey still didn't buy it. Like, even to the point, Walker's like, wait, are we stalking your mom? It's like, yeah, but my mom's hiding something. Obviously, it's like there's something that's going on here. She's not talking about. Walker at first is kind of like, okay, your mom did admit to it, so maybe things are just kind of open and shut in that regard. But Mickey ends up telling a story about like when she was younger, like her mom, like she would kind of cry a lot, and like her mom would kind of take her to the trolleys to it calm her down. And she says like back then, like her and her mom were in a good place, but she's like at some point their relationship ended up changing, and for her it's a situation where it's like her mom wants to protect her, but Mickey wants to protect others. And it's really interesting when you kind of dive into that, especially because, we get showcased of that later on when she takes Walker to that place with the tacos. And it's like, oh, yeah, the guy, he's actually a friend. Well, not really a friend. Actually, he's the first guy ever arrested. So, it showcases, like, how, Mickey was able to cut. She's like, yeah, but I kind of helped, but it was mainly on him. But Walker says, like, oh, that's kind of proof of how you're very much like your mom. Like, your mom does what she does because she believes in justice and, doing right by people. And it's like, regardless of, you might not want to admit it a lot, like, you do share a lot with your mom, especially in that regard of, like, you care about people a lot and you want to do what's best. I mean, obviously, that's also why she's doing what she's doing, because she cares about her mom a lot and she wants to make things good. Because the sad thing is, like, too, because for her it's like she feels like she can never make her mom proud, and it's kind of, she's like, oh, I think I must sound kind of crazy and stuff like that, but Walker like made her feel better by being like, no, I got your back, we'll kind of figure things out. She's like, whoa, you were just kind of all about my mom probably did it. But it's like, no, like, it's like, I've always got your back. We come at this from a different angle now, so I've always got your sixth partner. And I thought that was pretty dope. The case takes some interesting developments when they end up tracking Adriana to someone's house, a lady named Mercedes, who Mercedes immediately is like, Adriana's nothing but a good person. I immediately was thinking like, okay, like Adriana has definitely got to be lying for somebody, but why? And we find out it's like, oh, this Mercedes lady. But it's like, so it must be someone important to her that, like, whatever the case may be, Adriana's like, whoever does take the fall for this, because of my circumstances, maybe this being my first offense or whatever, I've always played by the rules. Like, I will not suffer as big of a ramifications if Mercedes were to take the fall for it. But that's because, well, later on, Mickey ends up remembering a memory of like her at the trolleys with her mom, but Mercedes being in her front seat. And, she finally confronts her mom after having that memory to, be revealed. I was like, wait, are we? And lo and behold, it turns out, yep. Mercedes is actually Mickey's mom. Her mom, Adriana, is actually her aunt, Adriana. And they kind of went into some of the backstory, kind of explaining, like, it's like your mom was a drug addict. Well, an addict is always an addict. There's no kind of was. It's kind of a lifetime thing. But she asked me to look after you. Adriana was like, yeah, your mom asked me to look after you. And those weeks turned into months, which turned into years, until like 3 years later she came back clean, promising like, hey, I'm ready to take my daughter back. But Adriana didn't believe her and figured that she would kind of fall off the wagon eventually. So it's like also like, you're my daughter, so I wasn't willing to give you over to Mercedes. So Mercedes basically took a payout. Now, whether that was a one-time payout or whether it was multiple payouts, which either way, it's got to hit her hard, because it's like, in her own mind, it's like, wait, I sold my daughter. It's like, because even Mickey was like, wait, she sold me? Like, that is kind of messed up and comes with its own issues. But it's like, I'm sure, like, at the time, Mercedes probably, like, now in retrospect, she probably regrets it. That, I think, ended up being a bigger issue because Adriana even said, like, they moved out of town, she changed their names, and still her sister tracked them down. Which makes me think, like, Mickey must have never known that Adriana had a sister, because I'm sure she probably would have avoided that, because if she ever admitted it, it would have been like, oh, so why haven't I been introduced to your sister, my aunt? And it's like, well, it would have led to the whole revelation that, Mercedes is actually her mom, so that's a whole thing. I'm sure, obviously, to avoid all that is probably why Adriana's probably never brought it up before. Maybe she has and just kind of skirted around the subject. I don't know. But, obviously, Mickey is kind of upset about this discovery, because for her, it's like, not only it's like, for one, Mickey's not even a real name. Her real name's Nina, and it's like everything that she's ever known is a lie. And it hits her so hard, too, because it's like she's always strived to make her mom proud, and now she understands why she never could. Because in Adriana's mind, it's a situation of she didn't want Mickey to stay with Mercedes because she didn't want Mickey to get dragged down with her, like whatever her life ends up becoming. And it turns out the time of the accident, like Mercedes had tracked down Adriana and wanted to see Mickey, but Adriana said no, and they got into a fight, and that's when her sister drank. So for her, she's taking responsibility, not only looking after her sister, but also partially blaming herself because she's the one that caused all this. But it's also like, it's a sad situation. So, but I think because she's trying to overcorrect, essentially, is what I thought was so fascinating. Like, I think because she's so worried about Mickey ending up anything like her mom, that I think she overcorrects in many different regards. Like, obviously, like, she has a tendency to kind of like psychoanalyze her daughter too much, but I think that's a byproduct of that. Not just the way she is and just the way Adriana like operates, but I think on some level of like, I need to make sure you go down a path that isn't anything like your mom's. Because it's also the thing of like, but then like, why is it her being a part of the military and being a police officer? Like, why does that rub you the wrong way? Especially because we ended up finding out she's dating a cop. That ended up being a whole thing. I kind of went into it a little bit more during the original recording. Like I said, I do apologize. But like Mickey had brought that point up about like, yeah, you're dating a cop, Mike, and it's like, but for Adriana, it's like, well, I'm kind of growing and processing, so it's kind of like my opinion on things have kind of, I'm kind of opening up my worldview a little bit, and it's like, oh, you didn't kind of have that same perspective and progress and processing when it came to me being in the military and kind of where I am right now. So I think, like I said, I think it's her just overcompensating. But now going forward, this changes her relationship. It's sad because she was working so hard to like, mend fences between her and her mom. But now it's just like, not only like, I find out like, my life is a lie, because it brings into question. I'm sure it can lead to a very like, very introspective, not just introspective, but existential crisis of identity, because everything you've known about yourself is a lie, even your name, so that's got to lead to some complications. She even, drops by Mercedes' place, but she doesn't actually go in because it's too much to bear. Like, like her entire life got turned upside down, which, the person she ends up confiding into first is actually Walker, which I think Walker can understand, obviously under different circumstances, but having your life be one thing and to just have it kind of completely turned upside down, he, like I said, different circumstances, but he understands that. I wonder, is she going to tell Trey in between episodes, or is that going to be a conversation we see them having potentially in the next episode? I'm really curious about that, but also like how Mickey handles this going forward now that she, knows the truth. I wonder, did Mercedes recognize her when she met? Probably not, because she didn't really give her name, because Walker was just like, oh yeah, this is a social worker. Like, obviously they didn't want to give her, so of course she wouldn't know that was her daughter. I mean, obviously it's been years, decades, so like of course she probably wouldn't recognize you. Probably the last time you saw her was when she was 3 years old, so understandably so. So that's going to be a sad and complicated situation, but I'm curious to see what kind of effect this has on Mickey going forward. So there's that side of things. There's also the situation with, obviously, I think the team, the soccer team had gone on, like, I guess it was more so like a retreat or whatever, and Stella's inviting Trevor, which obviously Trevor just had a whole thing with his dad. His dad blaming Duke for, Crystal's death, which is like obviously 100% BS because that was on him, because he's the one that wanted to rob the place. He wanted to go guns and blazing because Duke was like, Walker as Duke was like, no, this wasn't how things were supposed to go. We need to get her help. And it's like, no, I'm fine. Like, because of the way he handled things, she, like, wounded and everything, went to go try and hide the money for his sake and everything. So it's like she died because of him, not because of Walker. Walker tried to help her, tried to say, like, we need to surrender so we can get her some medical aid, but he didn't want to listen. It's like, yeah. And he has the nerve to blame Walker and tell, or at least say, like, Duke is responsible for your mom dying, Trevor, blah, blah, blah. And obviously, it's kind of been inside of Trevor's head. Like, obviously, he shows up. Because we don't know what his main purpose. Like, obviously, he fell for Stella before finding out the truth and everything, but I wonder, did he show up there because he's trying to get closer, to get close to Walker? But also, he's kind of confused because for him, it's like he's a little distracted, but at the same time, it's like, I came here to be closer to my dad, but now I want to do anything. I kind of just want to get as far away from as possible from him, because I think for him, he sees, like, his dad for who he really is and kind of recognizes, like, oh, like, I think his dad was probably kind of suggesting, like, oh, you need to, like, get close to this. Like, we didn't get that insight in the episode, but maybe it could have been a thing of his dad suggesting, oh, get close to this girl. I mean, who knows how much Trevor talked about it. He probably didn't go too much into it, just only that, like, oh, I found out about this Duke guy. I think he's the reason why you're in jail. I'm sure it leaves you with some complicated feelings, because it's not like your dad's a good guy, and I think he recognizes that. Hence, his dad wouldn't be in jail in the first place for the crimes he committed. But, interestingly enough, like, for Trevor, like, the good thing about living here is being close to Stella, and I just thought that was kind of an interesting thing. Obviously, that was it. That Northside gang or whatever they're called ended up causing trouble, and Trevor stepped in and kind of looked out for everybody when they were threatening everyone, guns out and everything. Luckily, Walker and Mickey show up in time because Trey had called them about the kids going missing, and they all kind of joined up to look into it. And luckily, everyone ended up walking away okay. I thought it was interesting too. Like, he called Walker Duke, Trevor did, but I don't think Walker, under the circumstances, heard him. Maybe he even thinks, like, oh, maybe I misheard him or something like that. But the way he was pointing the gun, it was unclear whether he was pointing at the dude or whether it was Walker. I initially took it as him pointing at Walker. It's like, oh, you're kind of the reason why maybe my life is so terrible, because you took my dad away from me, but you're the reason why my mom's dead. So I think a lot of that was kind of running through his mind, but he was like, oh yeah, this guy had the gun. I don't know. Or whether it was just him pointing the gun and actually pointing at the guy, I don't know. It might be him. Later on, he might have been making an excuse like, oh, I couldn't pull the trigger on the guy being Walker, not just the Northside gang dude. But Walker ends up talking about what he did was brave. He's like, no, I couldn't even pull the trigger. And he's like, no, you standing up, having guts to protect everyone like that is brave. But also not pulling the trigger is brave too, because that would have changed your entire life. He's like, Walker knows what it's like to be on the side of things of pulling that trigger and what that means, how it can change a person. And he's like, I wouldn't want to put that on anyone, especially, someone of your age either. So it's a situation of you did the right thing. And I wonder, does that complicate things for Trevor? Because I think maybe for him, it's like, oh, I see Walker for kind of being like, oh, he's not the bad guy my dad kind of made him out to be. And it's like, well, your dad is an actual bad guy. But regardless of Walker being a Texas Ranger, like, does it make him, it doesn't stop the fact it's like, yeah, my life got turned upside down because of you. Once again, because you're your dad. But, Walker played his own part. And so maybe on some level he resents him. But it's also the thing of he does care about Stella. And it's going to be interesting to see how Trevor handles this going forward. Because I almost wondered if he was going to confront Walker and tell him the truth about who he is. Like, oh, I know who you are, Duke, and blah, 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 blah. But he didn't. But I think when the truth finally does come out, it's going to change a lot between him and Stella, and maybe even how Walker potentially views him. I don't know. We'll ultimately have to wait and see, because it's going to bring into question, like, wait, did you get together with Stella because you knew who I was and she knew that she was my daughter? Like, was this your plan the entire time? It could go down that route, but we'll have to wait and see, like, ultimately, because Trevor kind of doesn't want to, he, like he said, he wants to kind of have nothing to do with his dad. He wants to be near his dad, but also kind of have nothing to do with him at the same time. So those complicated feelings is going to be interesting to see. Obviously family situations, we see that with Mickey, and now we see it with Trevor too. It's going to be interesting to see how both of them kind of respond to these current circumstances. An interesting byproduct of this episode too was like the whole August thing, because obviously he was trying to get close to Ruby, but then he finds out like, oh yeah, Todd, he was like, oh yeah, like, I was going to do the photography stuff so that you guys could go to the dance together and stuff like that. And Belle is nearby, and she's like, oh, August, could you help me with something? She's like, yeah, I saw kind of that awkward situation you were in, so I wanted to kind of bail you out. And she said something I thought was actually kind of, I really like the line of like, I think it's like, when someone gives you fireworks, it really kind of sucks when you're not able to kind of give them back to them. And I thought that was a very like romantic and beautiful way of kind of phrasing that. I'm sure I butchered it, but I think it was something along those lines. Actually, August and Belle actually got closer during this episode because she ended up confiding in him about the whole thing of like, yeah, her parents went back to Mexico because she's a natural born citizen. She's a U.S. Born citizen, so it's a situation where their circumstances could affect her circumstances, so she could legally stay there because obviously rather than waiting to be deported, because if they waited to get deported, she could have got dragged into this. They ended up just straight up going back to Mexico. So, and Belle hasn't talked to anyone about it, not even Stella. So August ended up being that first person. So when it was all said and done, he sets out that whole situation of the fireworks thing, like, oh yeah, like here like Stella gave me your parents' number, and we kind of all worked together to set this up. And it's like, Belle really appreciated it because it was like her way of kind of talking to her parents, like they were so close to Mexico, so that they could set that all in motion. But I thought that was kind of really sweet. Even Walker being like, oh, that was really nice of you to do that, August. And I was like, yeah, anyone would do that. And it's like, oh, and you have Mickey being like, oh yeah, where did that humility come from? Definitely didn't come from your dad. But what's also interesting too is like later on, Ruby, now Belle is like, hey, do you want to go to the dance? Just as friends or whatever, because she was appreciative of him setting that all in motion, and he doesn't really respond. But nearby, you see Ruby kind of looking at August, and then immediately kind of looking at Todd, because I think she's having conflict, because it's like she's kind of, I think what's going on between her and August, I think she kind of started feeling it too. But she's with Todd, so I think, which when I hear Todd, I immediately think of the Magicians. I actually kind of went down a whole bit about, that whole conversation when I hear the name Todd, that being the thing. But regardless, that like I said, it just makes me think of Todd from the Magicians, which is one of my favorite, like, just side characters. But, yeah, I'm curious to see where that ends up taking them, because it might be a thing of, Belle is aware of how August feels about Ruby, so I don't know if it's a thing of like, because when she said that, I don't know if she was necessarily saying that because maybe she feels that way about August and he never recognized, much kind of like maybe Ruby hasn't quite recognized. Maybe it's a thing of she hasn't quite recognized how she feels about August nor how he feels about her. I don't know. It's going to be interesting to see how that plays out, but it seems like that situation might have sparked her interest of like, maybe it made her go, oh, August is going with Belle? Huh. We'll see. I love the whole thing about, Todd being the idiot that he is, because he had that whole thing about like, oh, I'll help you out, little guy, which August is like, dude, we're like literally the same height, and he's talking about wearing the sunglasses, the light hitting it at like the 42-degree angle, and it's like, and then Trevor and August having that moment of like, yeah, only idiots wear sunglasses indoors, and it's like, yeah, Todd, and they're like, yeah, so that was interesting. Another side of this episode involved James and Liam in Mexico, and obviously it led to a really interesting conversation where they were talking about the fact that Jerry was 2 miles away at the time of Emily's murder, so she's not directly involved, but there still might be an indirect direct connection in that regard. So she's still involved in obviously this money situation going to Carlos's niece's art place, which I think her name's Victoria, What was interesting, though, is like it seemed like her and James were hitting it off, interestingly enough. And he had talked about it a little bit in the episode, being like, oh yeah, I'm recently divorced, so, but it seemed like they were vibing and stuff like that. I was like, oh, that's interesting. Also seems like a little bit of a conflict of interest. I mean, you're kind of investigating things. Her uncle kind of got arrested. Turns out he's actually one of the people obviously responsible for arrest, because she even calls someone later on because she immediately recognized who James was. Makes you wonder, does she recognize who Liam was? Maybe not. But, it led to this whole. I thought that was immediately interesting, especially because later on, their car, James' car gets blown up when he presses the alarm. So it begs the question, like, because eventually, some of the names on the guest book, or I forgot what it was, like something they were investigating. All this led them to some connections to the Northside gang that Walker and them had actually ran into in this episode. There was some correlation there, which I guess I think that's kind of interesting. Granted, it was under different circumstances. The way Walker talked about it, he had already like dealt with them before in Texas, like under a particular case. So actually, had busted some of their people before. So this actually. There's a connection with the Emily thing, but also like previous run-in plus this episode run-in. So it's interesting. But my thought and wonder is, like, with this Northside gang being in particular connected, they're thinking, like, okay, maybe that has something to do with this money, and maybe that's why Carlos took the fall, because maybe Emily stumbled across this gang's activity, and she ended up getting caught in the crosshairs, and they took, that's what happened, and that maybe that's why Carlos took the fall, because this gang was kind of threatening him to take the fall. Maybe, maybe not. Another thought process is that because of James' car blowing up and everything, it either means like, hey, Victoria's in with the wrong crowd, and it's like, oh, you're responsible for locking my uncle away, like, I want to get back at you, not realizing they're here to kind of clear her uncle's name, or she's neck deep in all of this, and maybe Carlos is taking a fall because not only does he want her taken care of, but also he wants to make sure she stays out of like whatever it is potentially they're all mixed up in, whether it's some gang, maybe it's this Northside gang, maybe it's someone else entirely. Maybe he thought like, if I take the fall for this, you leave her alone, not realizing she's neck deep in it. Or maybe she just herself on her own is neck deep in it without her uncle realizing it. So it might be she might be a big player in this. Maybe because she might not be the innocent bystander that we think she is. We don't know. It's just interesting that she calls someone up immediately about, hey, the guy who arrested my dad, my uncle was here. So it might be about covering tracks because they're getting too close. Now, whether that's just because the person she was talking to knows what's up and she's in the dark, or whether she's in a lot more enlightened about what's going on here, that begs the question, like I said, whether she's an innocent bystander or whether she's just neck deep in all this connected to Emily. We'll ultimately have to wait and see. I talked about this in the original recording, and I'll bring it up here too, was the whole thing about, I like the whole thing with Walker, like handling that Northside gang guy. He was like, oh, I'm coming after your daughter, or blah, blah, blah. And Walker grabs him, but instead of like using violence, he's like, oh, you assaulted me by like shoulder checking me, but also like threatening my family, so that's an extra 12 months. Get out of here. Which Mickey's like, oh, look at you restraining yourself without restraining without retaliating. And she's like, yeah, but you got the code wrong. He's like, oh, it was close enough. She's like, no, you weren't. Which kind of takes me back to the whole thing I thought was pretty dope at the beginning, where obviously they had that conversation, like, I forgot, what is it, like Robert's Radio or something like that, and she's like, Arkham Razor, you chump, because it's like, I guess like maybe that's how they referred to it in his family, like that was their name for it or something like that. I love that. I love how close him and Mickey have gotten. I also like that him and Trey are gaining a bit of a bromance, the whole like burned hand thing throughout the episode. And nah, if I ever need a savior medic, and it's like, I know where you're at, and it's like, yeah, I'll be here or something. Like they're just like bromancing it up, and Mickey's just kind of like, yeah, come on, let's go. Yeah, like I said, a lot of interesting things went down in this episode. I'm really interested to see where things go. Like I said, I do apologize. I really shouldn't. I have just like started this recording like after losing the original recording, but it's just like if I didn't do this now, I probably wouldn't be able to bring myself to eventually do it. So I'm like, I have to do it now. Hopefully I don't screw up and lose this recording too. Till the next time we meet, be happy, be safe, live life to the fullest, and enjoy it. Good day and goodbye.